Welcome, in this room. I'm Julie Frère. I'm responsible for media relations and public affairs at the Testachat, Belgian consumer organization, co-organizing this event today with the Euro consumers. And next to me is Laura Klaas, as the spokesperson for the Flemish side of the country. Just a few practicalities. We will start in English, as you can hear, and we will start with a keynote speech from Professor Kersbilk in English as well. And then we will have a debate between prominent politicians in French and Dutch. So for the people who are not fluent in French and Dutch, we have simultaneous translation available. I hope everyone has his or her headsets. So this workshop will revolve around critical questions. What are the respective roles and responsibilities of the main stakeholders, decision makers, private sector, civil society, and consumer in driving sustainable consumption? How can all these stakeholders join forces to curb our impact on the environment? How can we make the sustainable option the most attractive one for consumers? And how can we ensure that consumers are well informed about their choices?
Thank you, Julie. And that brings me to our keynote speaker of today, Professor Bert Kersbilk, Professor of Law at the University of Leuven. And by the way, little side note, also my Professor of Substantive Law at the European Union a little more than 7 years ago. Right now, he lectures mostly in commercial law and European economic law, and is also co-director of the Research Institute Consumer Competition Markets, also at the KU Leuven. Recently, his focus has shifted more towards sustainable production and consumption and circular economy. And today he will talk about environmental, social, and governance aspects of sustainable consumption and production, about eco-design, and about possible taboos in existing consumer law when talking about sustainability. Professor, the floor is all yours.
Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to this first session. First of all, I would like to thank Euroconsumers for having me today and to be a speaker at this panel. I will talk about the feasibility of sustainable consumption and the role of citizens, lawmakers and stakeholders. I will first give the broader picture. Sustainable consumption, of course, but we also need to talk about sustainable production, the SDG 12. And I will focus on an important supply-side regulation, the ESPR, the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, which aims to make sustainable products the norm. And then I will look into a number of recent demand-side initiatives at the EU level to make EU consumer law more sustainable. Finally, however, I will also pinpoint, as was already told, some blind spots, some possible taboos in the current debate on sustainable consumer law. Let's start with the problem. As eloquently stated by David van Rijbroek, we are colonizing the future. Colonialism is not just something of the past. We are today colonizing the future. As if there was nothing in the future, as if there were no one living there, as if it were all ours, as if we can just go our own way, as if we can exploit, exhaust it, use it. We can rob our children and grandchildren in it and even restrict their freedom or condition their health. This is the basic idea, of course, that the consumption, our consumption, the impact thereof is enormous in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, resource use, biodiversity, use of land, water, etc. So it's well known that, of course, the traditional linear economy exhaust natural resources and has these huge environmental impacts. In these traditional linear models, you all know, manufacturers produce products and commercial intermediaries transfer ownership over products through a long commercial value chain up until final consumers, who then use these products for some time and finally throw them away, discard them, they become waste. EU consumer law currently is still very much focused on this traditional linear model of the one-off sales to final consumers. And EU waste law and recycling law, environmental law, has to some extent tried to mitigate the worst consequences of this global impact by, for example, establishing a waste hierarchy, which you can see on the slide, and also by establishing certain EPR schemes, extended producer responsibility schemes. A gradual shift, however, towards a more circular economy is now taking place, and here the key concepts are, of course, resource efficiency, life cycle thinking. The idea is that in a circular economy, the ambition should be to keep products and resources in the value chain for as long as possible. That is, in other words, closing the loop. Now, in line with the SDG 12, also the EU has tried to come up with legislation and adopted legislation, on the one hand to promote sustainable consumption, but also to promote sustainable production, addressed directly to manufacturers and other business actors in the value chain to try to achieve this sustainable production. And of course, I will not give you a full overview of all this legislation in this keynote, but before maybe having a brief look at it, looking at the new Commission, the new von der Leyen Commission. You know that the first von der Leyen Commission put this European Green Deal on the table and a new Circular Action Plan. The interesting idea of the new Circular Action Plan of 2020 was that for the first time, initiatives were also announced going to the core of private law, so not just internal market law, product legislation, or environmental law, but also to private law, contract law, consumer contract law. Now, if we look at the political guidelines nowadays of the new Commission, the President-elect at that time, we clearly see continuity as regards the aim to achieve the Green Deal objectives. That's a positive thing, I would say. However, it is combined with some dissonance and some counterpoints, you could say, in the new political discourse. So on the one hand, it's clearly stressed that we should go on with the same agenda. We must and we will stay, and I quote, the course on the goals set out in the European Green Deal. And on top of this, a Circular Economy Act, will that be a regulation, is announced in this document. As part of the, and I quote, continued shift to a more sustainable pattern of production and consumption, retaining the value of resources in our economy for longer. But on the other hand, we read about an ambition and the perceived need to come up with a clean industrial deal in order to implement the Green Deal framework in the simplest, fairest, and most cost-efficient way. And this means more generally that competitiveness, as you all know, will be high on the agenda of the new von der Leyen Commission. This is also the bottom line of the Budapest Declaration that you also see on the slide. I quoted 2 parts that was adopted last month. So certain pieces of the Green Deal legislation could be reshuffled or even watered down. And the idea of an omnibus regulation for taxonomy, CSDDD, and the CSRD is just one example. So the rightward shift at the level of the European Parliament and also in member states could potentially heavily impact green policy, perhaps not so much at the level of the Commission initiatives for cutting red tape in the Green Deal legislation, but rather at the level of the European Parliament and the Council, which might want to reopen some of the debates and make more significant, substantial changes as to the content of the legislation that was adopted in the von der Leyen I Commission. even if that legislation is not yet properly implemented in the member states. So as I told you, the EU has adopted a lot of legislative instruments, and you could basically say in 3 chunks. First, new rules on global value chains, on sustainable finance, on product requirements. Second, on the marketing and contractual and use stage. And third, on the end-of-life stage, the waste and recycling stage, with, for example, the idea also to come up with binding targets for reduce of food waste, to establish an EPR for textile, and so on. Now, if you look at the supply side regulation, in particular the ESPR, this is broader, part of a broader set of legislation, and of course sustainable production comes logically and also chronologically before sustainable consumption. You see here a large set of instruments that were all adopted over the past 2 years. And you could actually, and I quote here Anna Beckers, a colleague from Maastricht University, you could cluster these legislation in 3 different types. A first one would be legislation that regulates these global value chains, focusing on an individual actor, the main company in the value chain. Yeah? A good example of this approach is the CSDDD. A second approach is to say we will take a collective actor approach. We will focus on all the business actors throughout the value chain. This is a network approach, and the Product Liability Directive is an example of this one. And then thirdly, also very powerfully, is focusing on the product itself in the value chain. And here, deforestation regulation is an example, but also the ESPR. And this ESPR, for those who don't know, in essence, it will be a game changer. It focuses on, the basic approach is to allow only, in the future, sustainable products to the EU market. Combine this with the Brussels effect, and it can be very powerful. So there will be free circulation of circular products only. This framework replaces the current Eco-Design Directive, which only focused on energy-related products. This framework applies to all movable goods, with a few exceptions, and also the sustainability criteria that you see here on the slide go very broadly. They cover not just resource efficiency and energy efficiency like under the current Eco-Design Directive, but much more elements of circularity and ecological sustainability, such as durability, recyclability, repairability, and so on. Now, as 80% of the environmental impact of products occurs in the design and production stage, the ESPR will be truly a game changer. Ultimately, the idea is that cheap and really unsustainable products will no longer be allowed on the market and will no longer be an option for you and me as consumers. This is called regulatory choice editing. The consumer choice will be limited to sustainable products. And a very important role is also to be played by the DPP, the Digital Product Passport, which is currently under development already for textile sector, electronics, and so on. And then finally, the ban on product destruction. First, transparency requirements for businesses who do destroy products, unsold consumer goods. And for textiles, there is already a ban right now in the ESPR. Yeah? Now, as coming to sustainable consumption and the number of files on sustainable EU consumer law, here it is clear that the EU is fully aware of the fact that these initiatives on the sustainable production side should be complemented with initiatives on the sustainable production side. And DG Justice study in 2015 has clearly shown that a majority of consumers is, and also ongoing surveys that a majority of consumers is willing to make greener choices, is also receptive for green claims in their consumer journey, but find it hard to recognize products that truly respect the environment. So changes to consumption behavior through a recalibration of consumer law are needed on top of changes of EU product and environmental law. And the idea is that EU consumer law should try to internalize these negative externalities. Now, for the marketing stage, we've had the adoption of the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive, the Right to Repair Directive, and a Green Claims Directive is currently under negotiation. You could actually say that all these initiatives, these three initiatives, they all try to come up or to stimulate better consumption, green consumption. Yeah, you see it on the slide. This is only one of the three strategies, the three approaches that were identified by other scholars that you see on the slide to come up with more sustainable consumer law. Better or greener consumption means that you try to promote the consumption of better alternatives of the same goods and services, for example, more durable, more repairable goods, and so on, combating premature obsolescence and so on. Currently, the EU is not yet focusing on promoting different types of consumption, like, for example, leasing or renting goods instead of buying goods. Yeah? There's a few references to this in the ESPR, but I don't see much happening in that area, let alone that the focus would be on the very politically sensitive idea of reduced consumption. Think about degrowth debate and so on. So this is just to highlight that it's all about promoting more sustainable consumption for those consumers who really want to go green. And now the ECGD is an important first directive. I will not enter into detail. You can see that I wrote a paper on it in the last issue of EU CML, should you want to read it. So the problem of greenwashing is addressed through these amendments to the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and also the problem of premature obsolescence is being addressed by adding a number of practices to the blacklist of the directive. And then secondly, this other major horizontal piece of consumer legislation, the Consumer Rights Directive, is being amended to ensure that there is better information on durability and on repairability at the point of purchase. Here, again, the approach is quite traditional. In providing more information, which is a classic tool of consumer protection. But on the other hand, there's interesting elements, the notice that will be given on the legal guarantee combined with a label on a commercial guarantee of durability, and that will be implemented in implementing acts by the Commission. Now, as I told you, greenwashing is a big problem. This will be addressed, and the fact that a number of greenwashing practices is blacklisted is important, just like the issue of premature obsolescence and the repairability information that will also be provided. For example, at the EU level, there will now be a repairability score for smartphones and slate tablets, and that will also come in the future for other product groups. This brings me to the Right to Repair Directive, which was negotiated, as you know, under the Belgian presidency, and you can see here one of today's panelists, along with one of my postdocs on the slide. This is a very important directive, quite naturally. Perhaps, however, it's a bit disappointing in terms of the amendments that it makes to the Sale of Goods Directive, because repairability is added to the objective conformity requirements, okay. And if the consumer, under the new directive, makes the choice to have the goods repaired, the liability period will be extended with 1 year. This is not maybe the major incentive to push for repair instead of replacement, but it is an addition to the current directive. I think the most important part of the directive are the standalone provisions, which in Article 5, for example, really oblige producers to, upon the consumer's request, to repair goods for which EU repairability requirements apply already under the ESPR framework. That is, for example, the case for washing machines. This should not be done free of charge. It should be done within a reasonable period of time. And I think that is a major breakthrough that was made if you compare it with the original Commission proposal. Now I come to an end with some of the maybe blind spots or things that I do miss currently in the debate. And first of all, I think there is a problem to be fixed with e-commerce. This is not on any files of the European Commission right now. You know, there's these enormous flows of goods flowing down the chain and back upstream, sometimes in other chains or going to landfill. For 20 years or so, and I of course understand, and I'm also happy about that, but for 20 years we really promoted e-commerce, the new technology and so on. We expanded consumer rights, mandatory 14 days withdrawal periods. Yet we see return rates are increasing. The data differ per country, but sometimes they reach up, for example, in the Netherlands, up to 70% for shoes. Returns if you buy online. We all know the idea of buy many, keep one. It has a huge environmental impact in terms of packaging, individual packaging, transport, loss of value, damage, destruction through transport, and so on. So one of my colleagues, or two colleagues, Evelyn Terrein and Elias van Hol, they wrote a paper on it. There is plenty of research about this, and I would still expect that here we get some new initiatives at the EU level. And of course, this will, for consumer organizations, also be something tricky to say to what extent should we maybe also limit certain consumer rights? Should we always have this mandatory 14 days, for example? Should we introduce new exceptions to this, yes or no? A second big element, and I already touched upon that, is the circular business models, where I currently, so these are models such as subscription-based washing machines, or renting, leasing, access-based consumption, in other words, where you no longer own, as a consumer, the product. And of course, the idea is that this could incentivize manufacturers to make more durable, long-lasting products. There's plenty of research about this. Currently, as a consumer, you do not have much consumer protection in this regard. And we, last month, one of our PhDs defended his PhD on this very topic and on the need of more consumer protection in product as a service systems. Yeah? So I would also hope that this is picked up, certainly because it is also having a potential as an enabler of the circular economy. Yeah? Okay, I come to an end, and this will be one of my last slides. If you look at the current debate, I think ESPR will be a real game changer. As I told you, it will take time though, because the Commission has to adopt these delegated acts for various product groups, and that will take time. But in the end, it will simply remove, as I told you, the most unsustainable products from the market. I think it should also be combined with a number of economic incentives, and that will probably also be part of the debate. How can we make more durable goods? Maybe there will have a price increase. Will they then be affordable for consumers? Yes or no? Also, I think we have to go with consumer law beyond just empowering for better or green consumption. We should also have this debate on other types of consumption and on reduced consumption to some extent. Of course, you know, in the hierarchy, the first step is sometimes to refuse to simply buy more and more and more. And I think that is also an important point. In order to effectively bridge the attitude-behavior gap and enhance consumer participation in the circular economy, I think we also need a number of new initiatives that might at some point also limit the consumer choice and lead to consumption shift or a reduction. In the end, truly greening EU market and consumer law will require some further limitation of consumer freedom and consumer choice. The current throwaway society is simply excessive. And consumer organizations and other stakeholders will have to show leadership, I think, and kill some of their darlings also of classic consumer protection law. I also read this to some extent in the book priorities for the EP election and for the new commission, by the way. And I find that very reassuring in a way. Also, as consumers, we play a vital role. A final fundamental remark that is not on the slide deals with the relation with the EU and the national level. To what extent is there still room for legislative experimentation if you get all these regulations at the EU level and these full harmonization directives? This, of course, creates interesting legal questions, and I'm a lawyer, so I like them, but it also creates a lot of legal uncertainty for businesses who are being confronted with national initiatives, differing national EPR schemes, and so on. So I come to an end. You see here some more information on ongoing research within our CCM. So if you have any questions, comments, I will be happy to onboard them during the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for all the insights on which we will discuss now in the debate. And as announced, we will switch to Dutch and French nu. Yeah.
Alors, nous avons la
So, first of all, we are very lucky today. So there are 4 decision makers, Belgian decision makers, who are prominent people. We hope, of course, that they will have different visions of the items we talked about today. So I would like, first of all, to welcome Mrs. Alexia Bertrand, State Secretary for Budget and Consumer Protection in the Flemish Liberal Party. Mrs. Saskia Brickmans, who's just started a second mandate as a European deputy for the Green Party. Mr. Yvan Verhofstadt, new European deputy in the Central Party, which is called Les Engagés, part or member of the Democratic parties. And last but not least, Mr. Bruno Tobak, who is also a new European Member of Parliament and who was also a minister representing the Socialist Party. So thank you very much for being here today. And I think that many interesting things were said by Professor Kersbilk. I'd like to thank him again. So let's then move to the main topic. So the objective is actually to look at the roles and responsibilities of each and every stakeholder. So producers, of course, producers are stakeholders, important stakeholders who can also play an important role in sustainable production for electronic appliances, energy, mobility, and so on. So these people, in fact, are very important in the chain. And they can also help us reduce our impact on the environment. So one of the questions that could be raised is the following one. So should the legislator impose stricter conditions to the private sector to make sustainable transition easier, or do we rather need to focus more on self-regulation? So just a few figures in our inquiries, in our studies actually. So consumers generally support such measures. So we can see that especially for CO2 emissions standards for vehicles, repairability index and so on. So 57% of consumers think that those measures are important or very important. So I'd like to start with Mr. Verhofstadt. So do you think that regulations today are the only way to be followed if we want to have a more sustainable consumption? Thank you very much for this question and for the invitation. Well, regulation, I know it's not the job or the mission or the responsibility of companies or consumers to make political choices. And I think that the legislator has a very important role. So it's the description of what makes sense for the communities who are representing the nation. And our responsibility is also to defend the interests of people who are here today, will be there tomorrow. Companies are not responsible for that. And I think that we really need at a political level to define a direction, to define a framework in which companies may optimize their tools and means as to be as efficient as possible and reach the objective that has been defined. I think it's really key for the legislator to do that, because if you have a company and if you try to manage your company, so you need to have some possibility of knowing exactly where you're heading to without any moving target. And then private sector, of course, may understand precisely what the objective is all about. You mentioned cars. Well, I think it's important not to change any target. So we have targets for 2035, but we also have targets for the year 2025. So there will be debates in the future months, and many automobile manufacturers actually will tell us that they are not ready for 2025. I think we can act in a more clever way, maybe, especially for the adaptation of fines, for trying to find solutions or sharing some responsibilities, some form of co-responsibility, because manufacturers, of course, are not responsible for that. You can't buy any electric car if, as is the case in Wallonia and Spain, of course, you haven't got any docking stations. Otherwise, of course, they will try to move the objective in the future and to postpone it. So we need the right framework and the right conditions to have a virtuous circle. And I think this should also be made profitable. This is true of companies. This is true also of customers, of consumers. We also need to think in terms of cost for future generations. So green is not simply nice. Green is in fact part of your responsibility. So we need to internalize external costs. But anyway, so I'd like to give you the floor as well.
Well, I wanted to put the same question to you, Mrs. Bertrand. Mr. Verhofstadt was very clear. Do we need more regulation? Well, I think it's a shared responsibility. Everybody needs to play their role, and the government should do that with clear regulations that is very clear, and we shouldn't have too many rules and regulations, but also the sector. We see many initiatives coming from the sector. Think, for example, of the banking sector that provides mortgages or gives better conditions when your house or your building has a higher EPC score, or in retail sector, repackaging of mushrooms, for example. That's something that was started by the sector, but also the consumer. And you've also mentioned it, Professor Kersbilk, the idea that maybe we should also have less consumption. And when I'm talking about less consumption, it's about no excess consumption. It's not about growth. It's about the idea, do I really need this product? Because we see, for example, with Temu or other apps and other companies, they are just trying to get people to buy products as if they were millionaires. So that is excess consumption. So I think that everybody has a role to play, but at the same time, We, of course, need a direction that is set out by the authorities with regulation. We've seen that we've already got a lot of regulation from this commission, which is a good thing, but now companies need to be able to digest that, and we need to support them. I have my doubts about some of these regulations. I think that everything that has to do with reporting, with a tick-the-box approach, we have to be very careful about that, on how we deal with it. It should be very well directed. Eco-design is a very good idea that makes sure that in the supply chain, products from the very beginning, from the design stage, are reusable, can be repaired. So we have to think very carefully about that, because it's a shared responsibility and everybody will have to play a role in it, the companies, the sectors, but also the consumers.
Disait ce matin.
This is also what Mrs. Perignon said some time ago regarding the administrative load for companies and the protection of consumers. We need to focus really on enforcement, and apparently, well, it's fairly difficult actually to speak about enforcement of legislation. Mrs. Breckmans, I'd like to ask you the question. So I mentioned a certain number of figures for consumers who support the principle of more regulations. There's unfortunately some discrepancy with what I'm going to say now. So if there are more regulations, and this leads to an increase in prices, so then there are some hesitations, some figures now. 25% of respondents could actually pay more for an extended guarantee on electronic products. Regarding animal welfare, on the principles, so 9 people out of 10 support an improvement of legislation on animal welfare, but 6 out of 10 agree to pay more, and only 50% accept an increase of more than 5%. So more regulation, does it mean higher prices? And if yes, so how can we remove that obstacle? Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, this is of course at the heart of the work I've been doing for 5 years at the Parliament, and now I'm in the Commission for the Internal Market, because we would like to harmonize rules and regulations and also make sure that there's fair competition between companies and of course respect of consumer rights. I'd like to answer the first part of your question. Well, regulation is important because on a voluntary basis it's not enough. And that's what the professor said a few moments ago. So we have objectives that have been defined, or that were defined rather, in 2019. So we all need to work to reach the climate objectives, and this is a necessity. So we need regulations for sustainability, even in companies. And many companies, by the way, ask us to define those regulations, but we need, of course, the same regulations for each and every company. Then you mentioned also the questioning of those objectives, and of course I agree with Yvan Verhofstadt. So when he said that we need common rules and that we need also to help companies as well as consumers to let's say, work in the same direction and try to reach the same objectives. Well, I think that politicians as well as legislators should be coherent and not change constantly regulations, because you listed, of course, the rules and regulations that were adopted in the preceding mandate. And I think this creates some imprevisible conditions, which is a disaster for our economy, actually. If you want the European Union to reach or to achieve those objectives in the social field as well as in the environmental field, it's important. Well, this morning we talked about the textile sector, so we had Zalando, we had online platforms, because we will also tackle this issue of e-commerce. And to look at regulations, online regulations should be aligned with those rules that apply to European companies or European-based companies. And that was one of the signals, actually, that had been sent by companies. So please stop reviewing your legislation constantly. So we need guidelines, we need regulations, we also need an easy reporting system, so as to avoid an explosion of the European market. And we should also avoid, of course, member states, or prevent member states from adding regulations to the existing European regulations, because otherwise, so this will increase the costs. And then, of course, we can tackle the issue of prices. So the fact of having small companies, SMEs, haven't got the same reporting tools actually as large or larger companies, well, this is again an issue. The objective, as far as harmonization is concerned, and I entirely agree with your observations, in Green Deal as well as in circular economy, so we haven't made any definition of the reduction of resources.
Well, to come back to the price,
Je vous laisse terminer alors.
Well, this is a scheme, of course, showing linear economy, circular economy, and recycling economy. For a circular economy, of course, you need to reduce your consumption. And if you look at the political level, I've never heard anybody saying that we need to change our consumption or our way of consuming things. We need to change habits, and the responsibility is shared amongst politicians. Of course, they need to give a vision, to provide people with a vision and define rules, but they also need to encourage companies to participate as well as consumers to participate in the game, and try to make people aware of the fact that we need to reduce our consumption, that we need to buy or to focus more on quality when we buy. And even if it's more expensive, it would last longer. And many studies actually show that buying cheap products actually is much more expensive than investing in better products and better quality. And this is something that we sometimes forget, of course, as we are now handling or tackling the issue of overconsumption. Advertising. This is also something important. So how can you have such aggressive advertising towards young people, towards teens? When I think of ultra-fast fashion, we know that social as well as environmental effects are terrible.
Terug te komen op die prijs, meneer.
Absolutely, and it is a fact that in the long term we can talk about it, but the price at the start, at the base, has always been a big obstacle to consumers to make this green choice. And of course, we all know that since the start of 2022, the buying power has been attacked, and buying power, surveys have shown, is the main concern for consumers. Now, durability is very important, remains very important, and we are asked very often to, okay, I wish to make this green choice, but how can we pay this? What would you like to say to them? I thought that already the previous person answered this question. In 2022, what happened in the field of buying power is adamant to the fact that we need to make our consumption more durable. We have seen a price evolution in derivatives and in other costs and manufacturer costs. Everything is interlinked. One becomes more solid and durable when one is less dependent on fossil fuels. I believe that this is a very important message. And secondly, I do believe that we have to stop to calculate at the moment where the products are in a supermarket, to calculate the price of a product is everything what is produced and everything what is extracted until the point of consumption, until other costs, cleaning up and everything. But that is not what the consumer sees. No one has to guarantee visibility, transparency. And secondly, things that are not visible, regulate them. 2 examples. The recycling of plastics in Coca-Cola bottles, plastic Coca-Cola bottles. They impose a certain recyclability content, and this is 0.5% in the cost price of the bottle. It is next to nothing, and there is no reason to have 2 bottles next to one another, one with a recycled product, the other with a new product in the supermarket. It the profit is gigantic because one creates a market for recycled content that is produced in Europe, recycled in Europe, in Flanders, by the way, and which promotes greenification and reduction of CO2 emission. So if you leave the consumer the choice between paying 2% more, 2% less, half of them will pay 2 cents less. One should not impose that choice. One should take responsibility in regulating. And the costs must be integrated in the product before the product launch. So this choice as a producer should be taken away. Green steel, if one produces cars on the basis of green steel, the extra price is only 1%, which is next to nothing again. And if we can, by doing so, reduce our CO2 emission, then we can generate a range of cost benefits. So the idea of having to say it is always more expensive, I'm sorry, this is a very old-fashioned concept. Stop asking that question. In the majority of cases, it is false, it is erroneous. In the long term, it will be cheaper.
It's quite interesting to conclude on that, and I'd like to know precisely what you think of this. So, sustainable, does it mean a sustainable product? Does it mean so that it's more expensive? Well, I've got some observations. First of all, if you look at level or the scale of the world, so waste average is 4,600 billion tons and euros. So if we produce in a more qualitative way, what this means, of course, that we will have less waste and it's more added value. So we shouldn't confuse, we shouldn't make a confusion between added value for companies, so profits, and added value for the customer, so that's the way he or she consumes. The upfront cost may be a bit higher, but let's take the example of a tire. So if you rented the tire, like a service, let's say, well, I will pay rent for tires. Well, then producers, of course, will have advantage in producing tires that may be much more solid. And this may maybe lead to a decrease in gross internal product, but certainly not in comfort. But very often it's much more expensive for consumers. But then we need competition, of course. And if there is competition in those products that you can rent, then of course the price will go down. But even in the design of the product, so we can do that. And a third element regarding the recycling aspect, we know that for some rare materials, it's quite difficult, especially for some metals. So if you have a battery, say we have a battery, well, it's fairly difficult here because we need to buy them from China. So we buy that, of course, at a very expensive price because we know that there's a dominating market, in fact, in China. So it's fairly expensive. And then when the battery doesn't work anymore, so what do we do? Well, we get this black mass actually from the battery sent back to China. China needs to recycle it and then sells it again to us. Because we need 90% of recycled material and so on. So again, we are depending on China and we pay the high price. And we create, in fact, our own dependency. But if we said, okay, well, you sell a battery on the market, and well, you need to anticipate for the payment of recycling, and we need to carry out this recycling in Europe, then we would not be dependent on China anymore. And instead of buying batteries from China, so we would actually create added value here in Europe. We would have more efficient recycling facilities, and then, of course, our well-being could also be improved. This is also true of Congo for some specific materials that we can get from there. And that's what the Commission has said. Well, even if we extract material from Europe, from the European soil, but if we get something in Portugal, send it to China for recycling and buy it back from China, so this is again a vicious circle. And recycling is a way of getting more autonomy.
Een tweede grote
I would like to talk about a second major obstacle in choosing more durable products. It is a lack of clear information vis-à-vis the consumer. Test Achat has filed a complaint against 15 food producers because they do not take into account the CO2 claim. So those claims, we have them in every sector, and Ms. Bertrand, you know that there are too many rules, and our service has shown that only 3% of consumers indicates to be certain to be able to recognize a misleading claim. We have taken a number of initiatives. We have, in the framework of the directive that is coming, and is this an idea to counter this greenwashing? It is a very good idea. We have hundreds of different labels in Europe. It is very difficult to know what is at stake. I'm really in favor of global labeling. And on the one hand, we must look at wastes, we must look at water consumption, biodiversity, and an eco-score is a good example of this practice. Eco-score is an initiative taken by the entrepreneurial world, and it is very important that regulations are created, green claims directives that will objectify these elements. A Nutri-Score, nutritious score, is another initiative taken by the food sector, and legislative initiatives were taken in France, amongst others, and it is a very favorable element for consumers. Relating to health, and a lot of explanation is to be given to consumers because a consumer not always understands why a product belongs to a certain category, why a certain product is a B product and not an A product, because I do believe that a lot of explanation is to be provided, and I believe that we must wait for the Green Claims Directive, and as soon as that directive is implemented, we will have to look at the number of labels in the EU, and a selection will have to be made, and then we will see if other measures are to be taken. I hope and I believe that there will be a great reduction of the number of labels after that. Well, when everyone starts to implement and follow and respect the directive is really scientifically researched, and of course, then we are at the observation element. Will this policy be enforced, followed? And that is the conclusion of the Commission. A lot of efforts have been made, and I do believe that the focus for the coming 5 years will have to be enforcement. After a number of years, that evolution will have to be studied, and a new balance, equilibrium will have to be found. New regulation will have to be introduced. We will have to clean our regulations. We will have to provide enforceability, enhanceability. And we will have to ask ourselves the questions, is this regulation acceptable? Does it serve its purpose? We will have to continue to evaluate regulation and see after 2-3 years what is the result. Will we have to correct? And as Ivan said, we need this law, respect of law. but we will also have to make corrections when the legislation is not effective enough.
So regarding the efficiency of regulations, so Mrs. Bertrand said that she was in favor of global labeling, with, of course, communication to explain what they're all about. But it's a challenge as far as sustainability environment are concerned. We've got the Planet Score, Eco Score, and so on. So there's some competition, actually, and we don't know which formula is or should be taken into account. So do we need to focus more on the rights of workers, on the rights of animals, animal welfare? So how can we integrate all of that into one label that could be understood by everybody? And regarding arbitration also, so this is not an excuse actually not to go further, because it's fairly complex at the European level. Mrs. Breckman. Well, I think it's a choice of society. It's quite crazy actually to raise the question of the multiplication of labels and communication with consumers. Buying environmentally friendly products should be cheaper. And if you have a standard for the import, standard for the market that respects some criteria, and you have also this enhancement capacity, because this has also been missing for some years. So then, of course, you won't even have to deal with those labels, because people will know that there are some rules that have been established by the European Union and that we abide by the law. Now, so we have dual systems, so we would like to increase the number of standards and improve the standards, and of course we are very strict on that, and the consumer feels protected. But on the other hand, so according to your inquiries, your studies, so there are some toys, for instance, that are imported from other countries, from third countries, and that don't even comply with the basic regulations. So how can we solve that issue? Well, we need regulations like that on eco-conception, eco-design. So by design, products that are bought online or in a shop need to respect a certain number of criteria. And we've been mentioning the environment, but I think this goes hand in hand with the rest of regulations. So many products that have access to the European market or are even produced in Europe do not abide by labor law, by a certain number of regulations. But anyway, so I'd like to come back to this issue of labels. Of course, we've been moving in the right direction, and we are waiting for indications from the Commission. So for this digital passport, this digital passport should include a certain number of indications, and I'd like to really insist on that. Be careful about digitalization, because there will be a fracture actually between those people who can make use of a smartphone and get information, and other people who are less trained, less connected, and won't have access to this type of information. So once again, we need to maybe think in another way and say, okay, well, respect of environment will be the first criterion as far as imported products are concerned. We need to control that, and what we also observe is, of course, this debate around Mercosur, for instance. So even if we have high standards, and even if the European Commission makes sure that we abide by European regulations, so we know that some products do not respect those regulations, and unfortunately, so you cannot see that, even with a label.
Mr. Tobak, one last question, general question. Do you see a role of the consumer organizations, for instance, to help make consumers make a choice for durable products, durable goods? I believe that the best way, consumer organizations, I consider them to be the representatives of the consumers. And your first role as a consumer organization is dual. On the one hand, one should explain to consumers where the costs are situated, the costs that are not reflected in the price, in the end price, in supermarkets, and that they will pay in the end. And on the other hand, I believe, and even more so today, that we have to address governments, European, Belgian, Flemish, and clarify what the difficulty to the consumer is to identify things. And I believe that, and I beg your pardon, but it is a rare occasion, and consumer organizations often represent the conscient consumers, but very little the man or woman that will buy its batteries at Lidl, for instance. And why do I give this example? When you go to Deleuze or a Carrefour, and when you buy batteries, Energizer or another brand, when you go to an Action or to a Lidl, the small ones, the AA batteries or the AAA, they are all made in China on ancient machines. They are previous generations of Panasonic batteries that one will not find in a Deleuze. And very often one does not have a choice, and one should enable that badly produced and hardly recyclable products, we should prevent them from being commercialized. The price difference is not that gigantic, but it does pose a gigantic problem. So the choice cannot only be the consumer's choice, it is a matter of regulation. When a product is available on the European market, and we know that, we cannot check. We know that it is not compliant with European legislation. And we also know that we cannot close our borders for it. And we should say to the consumer, okay, we have to regulate, we have to limit the choices of consumers. And that is the message that consumer organizations and other representative organizations should introduce to policymakers. That role is much more important.
So I think they should have a look at a tool for the comparison of batteries. So we're a bit late, and I'm really sorry, but I'd like to give the floor to Professor Kersbilk. But for 2 minutes, if possible, so to summarize the different challenges and main ideas that we can draw from this debate.
Okay, dank u wel.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't know that that was also part of the program, but I'm very willing to do it. I think that many interesting things were said by the different politicians that are here, and I think that many of these elements were also raised by myself and came back during the debate. I think that one of the recurring topics really, and that was to be expected because it's also the topic of this session, that there's really a role that needs to be taken up by all the actors in the entire story. So not just the legislator, but also companies. A lot of them are taking voluntary initiatives, and we should support them and facilitate that for them. But also the individual consumers and also other stakeholders, whether they are consumer organizations who, like I already said earlier on, need to address their approach and need to turn around so that, and they say that environmental protection is also a very important goal, and therefore they need to integrate that. And that means that maybe we should have fewer consumer rights in certain aspects and also have certain obligations to try and find a new balance between consumers and companies. And for example, the right to send back, should that always be possible? And I know that those are touchy things because these are acquired rights, but nevertheless, I think that we have to take environmental consumption into consideration, and that will therefore also lead to not just extra obligations for companies, but it might also lead to fewer rights for consumers and also some obligations for consumers. And I think that that is really my takeaway point, the biggest conclusion from this very interesting debate. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kersbilk, for those insights. I would also like to thank speakers